Thank you, Kathy. And let me say how honored I am and personally delighted to be back in Adelaide to take part in today's conference. And my thanks to the Dunstan Foundation and Housing Choices and Common Ground Adelaide for inviting me. So who here is wondering what's going on with the American presidential election and how we've ended up with the possibility of Donald Trump being elected? Anyone curious about this? All right. Well, now for all the fact that we have round-the-clock news shows and mobs of political commentators pushing for airtime, and politicians and pollsters whose job it is to understand the lives of citizens and the mood of the country, the remarkable thing is that no one saw this coming. No one predicted this. And somehow the experts didn't notice that many millions of Americans were feeling cast aside, unprotected by their government in their economic struggles, let down or exploited by community institutions, and increasingly desperate about the future. And the world is holding its breath now because a dangerous bully was the first public figure to recognize and manipulate the anger and fear that metastasizes when the bonds that hold our communities together start to unravel. And so I've titled my talk today, Homelessness is Not the Problem, because I believe that homelessness is a symptom of this same problem, the unraveling of the bonds that hold our communities together. Now, are any of you familiar with the phrase canary in the coal mine? Okay, good. I was afraid it was an Americanism and people would be looking at me. So, you know that canaries go down in mines with the miners before there were electronic detectors and would keel over if there were gases that could kill the miners, the early warning system. Well, I believe actually that the rise of homelessness that began in the late 1970s in the United States was the canary in the coal mine, was the early warning system that community bonds were beginning to break down. Because most of us don't personally encounter, in this room we're different because this is our work, but most people in our societies don't personally encounter desperate need as we go about our daily lives, other than in those uncomfortable moments when we see a homeless individual. And we know it's not right that a fellow human being, a member of our community, is so abandoned, but we don't know what to do. Even those of us who've worked in the sector are often confronted with how to make a good referral, what to do in that moment. So members of the general public, we understand that they don't know what to think. They don't know what to do. They imagine that it must be someone's job to take care of this, or that maybe the person isn't really homeless but just wants money, or aren't there programs for the homeless in the community that they're not using? And there's this whole, people get jammed and frustrated. They kind of the natural impulse to help gets sort of hijacked, and you start seeing this over and over again. And even something that's as unnatural as a fellow human being on the street, if it just becomes familiar, it stops feeling unnatural, and so it starts feeling normal. And so I think, allowing this to happen over 35 years, I think has really created conditions in our country and many parts of the world where seeing people suffering, we just kind of shut it down. And I think that's actually, that was the warning signal. But, and in fact, we have, in the United States, managed to make homelessness a multi-billion-dollar industry. At some moment where we missed what was happening, we gave up on solving the problem and started pouring money into managing it. And so the 2 points I want to make today are a warning and a path forward, and they're captured by this really quite extraordinary observation by Jane Jacobs. I'll let you just read that. So Jane Jacobs was an American-Canadian urbanist and student of human behavior. And this quote came from the last book she wrote before her death. And I think it does a very powerful job of alerting us that we're all in danger if our neighbors are being crushed by economic and social forces that they cannot manage alone, and if we don't act together to solve these problems. And that's the second point, and it's a hopeful one, because I believe, and we're actually seeing now, that it is in acting together to protect the most vulnerable people in our communities that we can all relearn the habits we need to strengthen those frayed community bonds and frankly save ourselves. Ending homelessness is the place we can begin this process. And I'll turn now to why it's not just necessary for all the reasons I've described, but possible. And I'll share with you how my colleagues and I, in a growing number of communities in the United States, have become convinced of that it's possible to end homelessness, and what we've learned thus far about how to do it. So I thought I'd start in 1983, when homelessness was a new issue in America. Now, older men with alcoholism who had lived hard lives, sometimes on the street, often in day laborer districts of our cities, had been homeless, but were actually, what changed in the late 70s was for the first time, growing numbers of older women, individuals with mental illnesses, young people, and families were seen on benches and parks and bus stations and other public spaces. And 1983 was also the year I started my first job as a full-time volunteer at this shelter, up there on the right, for runaway and homeless youth in Times Square. And I also volunteered overnight, one night a week, to supervise a temporary shelter for homeless women in the basement of that church on 42nd Street in Times Square. And now there I am, 80s hair and all, and you can note the graffiti and like the general kind of dinginess of the subway, because back in 1983 it was like when Times Square was still like a international symbol of urban blight. But when I was putting this together, I was remembering so vividly my thoughts about homelessness when I was starting, my volunteer job. Homelessness then seemed so urgent and so fixable. And it was like, if we could organize enough shelters and volunteers to staff them, we can fix this. Well, that confidence faded for me within a few months because something wasn't adding up. At the youth shelter, the young people could stay for up to 30 days. But I soon found that the problems of the young people I worked with were not temporary ones and could not be resolved in 30 days. Most were from the poorest neighborhoods of the city. Most were from families that themselves were in crisis. A number had run away from foster care homes. Very few were still in school or had jobs. Their health problems were rampant. Yet our shelter would discharge them after 30 days. And after a few months, many would be back. And now we had a very nice facility and dedicated staff and a small army of volunteers and actually ample funding. Funding was not an issue. But if I was honest with myself, which I tried to be, we were accomplishing almost nothing of enduring benefit for those young people. Now, the young people were safe and well treated while they were at the shelter, but we had done nothing to end their homelessness. It was frankly close to a revolving door. And meanwhile, at the church basement shelter, the women would be dropped off at the door by a school bus at about 9 p.m. after checking in at an intake center in another part of the city and being assigned to one of several churches or synagogues that had set up temporary shelter, thinking, in that same mood of like, we can beat this. Now, the women were exhausted by the time they arrived, and most went right to sleep. But some would stay up for a cup of tea and would welcome a chance to speak with someone. And after a few weeks, I'd heard a number of women's stories, but none of them knew what would happen next, where they could find help with housing or a job. They knew when and where to go to have shelter night after night, but there was no path out of homelessness. That they didn't know where to start. They had, very few resources to a person. It was just, everyone was stuck. And I remember when I began my work, I somehow imagined that someone in New York City had a plan for ending homelessness and that our shelters were part of it somehow, and that someone was in charge. And that confidence, when it started to erode and I realized, there is no one in charge, there is no plan, I remember how helpless I felt. And just how really brokenhearted that I didn't even know enough. I think I was 22 to be useful to the women and the young women and the young people I'd met. So I've gone into this detail about the early years of homelessness, which just happened to be the early years of my work, because I suspect mine is a common story, shared by many of you who work in the sector, of initial confidence and idealism followed by confusion and frustration. And if we are going to end homelessness, we're really going to need to recover that initial confidence that we had and that conviction that it can and must be done. And I also share this story because I think it's really valuable to reconnect with those first moments when each of us realized for the first time how broken the system was and that there was no plan. And I'm not just talking about housing. The people who needed mental health services, no system, no plan anywhere. And that moment of realization when it occurred to us that all of this desire to help and make a difference was going to be thwarted because there's no plan, that nothing adds up. Let's go back to that moment and think about what if we could change it. Because we know that the major barrier to ending homelessness is this broken system. And it's that broken community support system that makes people feel dispensable. All of these programs are out there. Why don't they work for the people who need them the most? And I think that's the reason so many people are frustrated and angry and fearful, because I think things are out there to help them when they're struggling, but they don't deliver when they need them the most. Now, we all know what happens. This happened to me. Those first moments of clarity about the broken system, they fade as we get acculturated into the dominant beliefs of our sector. I next concluded, well, it must be there's not enough political will to build enough affordable housing. And so I decided to learn how to build affordable housing, and that's what I did for 16 years. And did good work and all, but over time, over the course of those years, something again was not adding up. And that simple explanation of not enough political will to build affordable housing, it began to really seem implausible even to me, because we were building more housing and spending more and more money in New York City on homelessness, yet the rates of homelessness kept rising. And the numbers were up during bad economic times, they were up during good economic times. They were up during real estate slumps, they were up during real estate booms. And as we began working in other US communities, we saw the same pattern. New housing programs alone and new resources for the homeless were not leading to reductions in homelessness. So we began looking for the missing pieces of the puzzle. And it was finally homeless men and women who reminded us of the core problem. Our community support systems were broken. Now, what is a community support system anyway? Well, a system, simply put, is what holds things together, what connects the dots between things. Like, imagine in place of our skeletal system, for example, we had bones but no cartilage. Any of you who have had knee injuries or knee replacement know what that bone-on-bone feeling is like. And we humans, we would not be walking upright, actually, or moving at all without the cartilage holding our bones together into a skeletal system. Or what if in place of the operating systems that power our laptops, we had a collection of unrelated programs for word processing and storing files and sending emails? And can you imagine what it would be like if that wasn't all connected in a system? It would be impossible to complete a single function. But I think I've just described the reality of what confronts vulnerable people seeking basic, stable housing in our societies, or any support for that matter. In reading the National Review of Mental Health Programs and Services, it makes it clear that this is exactly the story of people needing mental health support as well. And the community programs that we have and are proud of, I don't mean in any way to diminish them, but what if all of our commitments and programs and worthy activity really aren't adding up to what they need to, because we don't have the coherence, the coordination, or the accountability to make them work as a system, make them work as a system that's easy to access, that's reliable, and delivers every time for the vulnerable people who need them. And I would say that it's this systems problem and how to build that high-performing housing system that ties in what vulnerable people need is the problem we must solve. And let me start building my case for why this is a solvable problem. Starting with, to a remarkable degree, Australia and the United States are succeeding in housing the vast majority of our people. Now, it's shocking and scandalous that probably 1.5 million people in the United States experience homelessness every year. But that's less than 1% of our population. And we have a much weaker social safety net than does Australia. And so what if we were to change the question from what should our homelessness policies be and how do we manage homelessness to, all right, we're like at 99%. How do we get to 100%? It seems a lot more doable. And that reframing makes it clearer to see that in wealthy nations like ours, we are really facing a different kind of challenge now. And it really is the challenge of the last mile. How do we make sure that everyone is housed? And that last group are our most vulnerable neighbors. And so it's really about how we connect that relatively small group for whom the conventional housing market is not working with stable homes. And this, I'll reinforce, is a housing systems challenge. And so what will be required for us in order to change this? And again, from a point of optimism, our communities have faced and solved complicated housing and community problems in the past. And during rough times, during wars, the height of industrialization, the Depression, communities came together and started getting stuff done. I had the privilege on Tuesday of speaking at an event in Melbourne, which caused me to do some research into the early housing reformers in Australia and the United States and England. And it was striking that what the successful housing reformers did then is really very instructive and mirrors what my colleagues and I have learned. Like the effective housing reformers of the late 19th and early 20th century got in the middle of the problem, told the story of what is, showed the rest of their society what was going wrong, but also offered models and evidence of what could be. They engaged their networks and enabled interactions between those of different backgrounds and different talents to actually pioneer the kinds of housing solutions and social support solutions that were needed. And frankly, much of what we value and take for granted about the quality of life in our societies and their basic decency and hopefulness owes a great deal to those reformers at critical times in our country's past who stepped up, often around housing and basic community supports, and really staked new ground for what a good society looks like and how people have to work together to create it. This isn't something that government creates alone. This is basically the heart of democracy, people working together to solve hard problems. And so, we really, there's a tradition we can draw on. And, again, what were the tools? What were the mindsets? Engage the problem, develop new models. That's how you change ideas and behavior. And, that really is our task, galvanizing communities to improve the conditions of life for the most vulnerable is going to require getting lots of people involved. And it's not a charity project. This is about working together to rebuild our democracies. And the common project is how we get that last mile of people housed accomplished. And so let me start moving toward how we learned our way into what the solutions look like for this housing systems problem. And we're still very much in learning mode, but we have seen and learned enough that I can tell you with confidence that there's some clear starting points. And sadly, it is the very social welfare bureaucracies and rules that we have created, all of us, and the separate organizations we've built that are getting in the way of housing 100% of our people. And let me tell you how we came to understand that. Now, 25 years ago, amid rising homelessness in New York, I started Common Ground to build what has come to be known as supportive housing, which is affordable housing linked to health and mental health and employment services connected right in the buildings to make it easy for people to get what they need and have help close at hand and an integrated kind of environment of services and housing. Having everything close at hand and having people responsible for making those connections meant that no one ever became homeless again. And supportive housing is a very smart idea. Residents would rebuild their lives in a mainstream setting. They'd be part of a community with other residents, able to contribute to the surrounding neighborhood. And our work expanded over the course of the 20 years I was there to over a dozen buildings and 3,000 apartments in and around New York City. And other organizations and communities started embracing the idea of supportive housing, including, I'm proud to say, a number in Australia led by the Adelaide Common Ground Project. And in study after study, supportive housing was also shown to be highly cost-effective, especially in reducing the cost of hospital and addiction services, because, no surprise, when people have a secure place to live and supportive relationships, their health improves. But as proud as we were of our buildings and the effect we were having on those formerly homeless individuals who lived in them, we could see for ourselves, being honest, that on the street outside our buildings, there were more people sleeping rough than ever. In fact, I was still passing on the streets of Midtown Manhattan many of the same individuals who had been living there before we opened our first building. And there are many good groups doing outreach to the homeless and distributing food and blankets and offering rights to shelter. And, I would occasionally just what aren't we doing here? And I'd call the outreach groups and they'd say, no, those people who are remaining on the street are service resistant. And somehow that, sufficed as an explanation. And I said, okay, we're doing good work, and we're making a difference for the many people who live in our buildings. And I just try not to, to look at the fact that, there are people living on the street right outside my door. But one day, one of those rough sleepers who had lived on the streets of Times Square for years asked to move in. This was not supposed to happen. Service resistant, no. Well, what happens, I got a call from a hospital social worker who told me that a woman whose name I didn't recognize actually had identified me as her next of kin and said she wanted to move into our Times Square building. And meanwhile, my colleagues and I, we had just mountains of applications for our housing from people living at shelters or low-wage workers. And so we were not going out looking for more people to apply to our buildings. And so this idea that, there's some people who just don't want to be housed, that's okay because we have plenty of people who do. But there are few things as powerful, I have to say, as having a fundamental belief exploded. And there it was, one of these service resistors, who is a fragile elderly woman named Sarah, wanted to move into our buildings. And as I set about trying to make that happen, I discovered something really troubling. Our own rules, like the ones I'd created, were in the way. We required then that individuals apply from shelters, that they demonstrate that they had been clean and sober for 6 months, that they had insight into their mental illness, and that they had a source of income. And oh yes, that they take their place on the waiting list, no matter how urgent their situation. Well, I decided we needed to toss out the rules. And so Sarah was discharged from the hospital and moved in. And the day she arrived, couldn't wait to ask her why she had not wanted help before, knowing that many people, myself included, I think this is why she thought we were connected, I'd stop and see if she needed anything to eat. But so people had offered her food and blankets and rides to shelter. And so she looked at me patiently and said, well, no one ever offered me help finding a home. And it is not an exaggeration to say that my understanding of homelessness changed completely that day. And the seeds of what has become community solutions were planted. Because what Sarah's story raised was the likelihood that we had gotten it wrong in starting with a housing solution, a program solution alone, no matter how beneficial or attractive or cost-effective. Because what if we had needed to start with the people experiencing homelessness themselves and figure out with them, person by person, what it would take to connect each of them to a stable home, using every resource in our community? Well, as soon as I could raise the money, I hired a truly great leader and a small team to do just that. Get to know each of our homeless neighbors on the street by name and help them find housing. And we set a goal of reducing street homelessness in Times Square by 2/3 in 3 years. Well, this required that we figure out person by person who had a temporary problem that could be resolved with a little bit of help and who would need comprehensive assistance in getting out of homelessness for good. And it seemed remarkable to us the more we got into this project. But even in the part of New York City where the numbers of people living on the street was the greatest, we found that most people were in a temporary crisis or had a lot of resourcefulness and could say, like, if these two things could happen, I think I can take it from here. And we were making amazing progress working with homeless people as opposed to offering them like what we had, just figuring it out together. So there was that large group who needed some very limited help and support. But there was another group that Sarah had been part of who had remained homeless for years and would need comprehensive and long-term help. And those in this group were among the most familiar people in Times Square, oddly and tragically, the most visible people in the neighborhood in many ways, and yet the least known. The working with out of our Times Square building, and the big building, so actually room for a lot of housing, we were able to reduce street homelessness by 87% in Times Square in 3 years. And the shocking thing we learned was this, that it hadn't just been us, that our government and not-for-profit bureaucracies had inadvertently made it virtually impossible for these very vulnerable people to ever escape homelessness. The various program rules, eligibility criteria, and no agreed-upon priorities for how our government and community housing would be prioritized and allocated had assured that only the most able to navigate bureaucracies would ever secure a stable home. And the people who needed the help the most fell further and further through the cracks. We began mapping the process that a single, overwhelmed, disoriented, ill person living on the street would have to follow to qualify and be prioritized for publicly assisted housing like these buildings. And we found it couldn't be done. You actually could not be eligible to move into this building built with public resources to help the homeless. No people living on the street could ever qualify to live there. And so the reality we uncovered was that it was not enough to have a good housing program or good support programs for the homeless if they never reached those who needed help the most. And we realized that this was about connecting the dots. It was a different type of problem, a missing cartilage problem. And so that's what clued us into, we needed to make new friends, like people who understood systems and how to actually integrate what people would need in order to have an effective result from the housing and support resources that existed in New York City. And I think and we've now worked in over 220 communities around the United States, and it's not just New York City. This is the problem. We are not working together. We are not making it easy for people who need us to be really delivering to get what they need, simply, respectfully, without a whole lot of hassle. And so the vision is how we design and track coherent, integrated, and accountable sets of activities that get people housed. And imagine, again, as a future state, not that healthcare is a perfect model, but some of the behaviors of the healthcare system are the ones that we have to adopt, I think. Physicians in hospitals diagnose and respond to individual conditions, not generic. Everyone gets their own diagnosis. That's what we need to do with housing. The healthcare system prioritizes and triages the most urgent cases. That's got to take the place of these static waiting lists and lotteries and things that are just vague. We need to get serious about who needs housing and what kind of housing and needs it fast. Communication between members of a care team in a healthcare setting is expected, especially the more urgent the crisis. People in the healthcare system understand that the goal is to get the person functioning well on his or her own as quickly as possible. So can we imagine local housing systems with similar aims that link all of a community's available housing assets and support resources and knew by name in real time the individuals and families who are homeless or facing eviction or had other housing risks? Imagine a common assessment like that at an emergency department and a consistent way of knowing who needs just a little bit of help and who needs really extensive and long-term help. This is a doable thing, and because we took this insight that communities need well-functioning housing systems, and 6 years ago we launched a national effort called the 100,000 Homes Campaign to spread this idea throughout the United States and to help communities learn how to do it. The goal that we asked people to rally around was to collectively, across the country, house 100,000 of the most vulnerable long-term homeless individuals on the streets of our country and get them into stable housing within 4 years. The other part of the challenge was, let's do it using the resources we already have. And let's discover the resources we need, let's find new resources if we must, but let's get started. So ultimately, 186 communities ended up joining the campaign. And what everyone had to do was to adopt a housing first approach. Like none of those crazy conditions about you have to have insight into your mental health issues and you have to be clean and sober. Just who doesn't get better if they have a stable place to live? So that has to happen first. You also had to form a community team of at least the 5 principal organizations in every community that controlled most of the resources, the health and mental health resources, the not-for-profits, the housing authority, the Veterans Affairs Department, and the mayor. And you had to be willing to collect the right data, like by name, prioritize data on who's homeless, and you had to be willing to share how you were doing, the progress you were making with other communities in the movement so everyone could learn together in real time. Well, fast forward, in the 4 years, these communities housed more than 105,000 people. And it was amazing, but we also realized it's a great start, but more needs to happen because it's tough changing habits and the way organizations work and actually building and maintaining this well-functioning housing system. And we learned it was going to take a deeper investment. So 6 months after the 100,000 Homes campaign ended, we launched the Zero campaign in January 2015. And we're now working with 70 communities, vanguard communities, who signed up to do something that they even thought was probably crazy, but they're getting there, which was to get to a sustainable zero on chronic and veteran homelessness. Just to basically start thinking about homelessness the way we would think about polio or Ebola. How do we just eliminate it? And let's start with these different categories of our homeless neighbors and learn how to do it so we can do it for everyone. And these 2 national efforts show it's possible if we shift our thinking. And we move our activities from operating collections of individual housing and support programs and letting bureaucratic rules and the market run its course to really creating disciplined, well-functioning housing systems. So in closing, I'm going to share what we've learned thus far about what it's going to take to end homelessness and the 3 things that we know communities must do. Know people by name, be willing to learn by doing, to just live with uncertainty, and to make success visible so we can inspire the rest of our communities and other communities. And so let me walk you through this. Whoops, I'm going to skip. The by name list revolution. Okay. Without real-time person-specific data, you just can't solve this problem. And up until probably December of last year, we still had these really brave communities saying, it's impossible. But now we have, I think, over 20 communities that every day can, are updating, and like it's the hospital emergency room, the jail, the outreach teams, the shelters. Everyone is putting their data into the same community database and knows by name every day who's homeless and keeps reprioritizing based on health risks and length of homelessness. This is, we're developing the technology to kind of make it easier for communities to match their resources to individual persons based on their preferences and various eligibility criteria, to try to keep those eligibility rules from ever being a barrier. It means totally going to the people. Like, you have to be out on the street every day and updating who may be coming into homelessness, who needs assistance. And so it's no 9-to-5 job. Outreach is like an urgent round-the-clock task. Now, the next thing I want to mention is and before going on to this piece, as communities are getting their by-name real-time data together, we're helping communities improve their housing placement rate. This was a concept that did not exist before. How long it takes from the time you meet a person who's homeless on the street till they're housed. It was, I went past one of those slides. Like, we had communities start by mapping the process that it would take one person to get from the street to home, and like these community teams were weeping. It was just, if it could even happen at all, it was well over a year. And this was with everyone trying hard. So what we realized was the length of time that it takes a community to organize its system to move someone into housing is like the blood pressure of a community. It has to be in a healthy zone. So communities are now aiming to do it within 90 days. The communities that are most aggressive and who are really moving fast have set 30-day targets. So learning by doing. This is like not what any of us were trained to do. And it's totally the new frontier. Most government contracts or institutional programs typically, kind of contract with you on a set unit of service to do something that is known, and they require a detailed plan and deliverables before the new approaches have even been tried. And so it's a real inhibition to just experimenting with what's going to work. But you're not going to house like hundreds of thousands of people if you're not going to be free to try new stuff. And so what really, we were able to persuade after, foundations made the early investment and showed what could happen. We were able to persuade government partners to allow communities to work in this experimental way, like try things over the course of 90 days to actually see if it could improve their housing placement rate. And so, this has really been, kind of an emerging new frontier. We've got these community teams, people who work for different organizations at the start of these processes. Like, they are mapping their data. They're getting in each other's space. They're trying to figure out how to better match their resources to what they're learning from homeless individuals about what it's going to take. You need to start with a shared view of the present reality, and then sort of as a group imagine what could be different and what the steps could be. And the people who are participating in this aren't the executive directors of organizations or the heads of agencies. It's the frontline workers who really know what it takes to get things done, and homeless individuals themselves figuring out, like, what if we did it this way, and whose permission do we have to get? So it's the job of the executive director or the agency head to kind of like clear the path, not to simply set policy. It's just to let the people who do the work, free them up to do it in new ways. It's really, just totally, hands-on. This is not work that happens from behind a desk. And the kinds of skills that we find communities need and that we're bringing to them is, the problem-solving tools that have really evolved in other industries, like design thinking and quality improvement and data analytics. So this is how you manage a problem that has multi-dimensions, and these frontline workers are just grabbing onto these new skills. It's also a leadership question. As communities put their by-name lists together and really kind of get their data down, we've had mayors all over the country go out, like this is the former mayor of Houston, Anise Parker. Mayors go out and just kind of model what needs to happen in their communities. And this is basically the work of constant improvement, just coming back together week after week, and especially at review periods every 30, 60, and 90 days when you're trying new things. Just like, did it work? What can we do differently? And so this is not the way we were trained to work, but it's the way we can learn to work. And I'm going to share this video because this is, I think, the most exciting thing happening. This is what we actually have now like debates in communities about the best way to define functional zero, and this is what we've learned. Like people can imagine getting there, and so.
We all want to end veteran homelessness, but it's hard when the problem is constantly changing. In most communities, people are moving in and out of homelessness every day. You've got to stay on top of those changes if you want to keep people from falling through the cracks. Ultimately, success means having fewer veterans experiencing homelessness than you're routinely housing each month. We call that functional zero. In other words, the average capacity of your housing system is greater than the existing need, and you can prove that with data. Let's take a closer look at what it takes to get to functional zero. Since veteran homelessness is constantly changing, a good system has to track it in real time. That means keeping a by-name list of veterans experiencing homelessness and updating it every week. A by-name list never stands still. On one side, you've got folks entering your system, some that may be new to homelessness, as well as those who have touched the system before and are now returning. In the middle, you've got folks that are actively homeless. On the other side, folks leave your system. Most enter permanent housing, but some may move out of your community, solve their own problems, or disappear. A good list accounts for all of these moving pieces at once. Let's say you start January with 10 actively homeless veterans. Throughout the month, 3 get housed, and we move 2 to an inactive list because they haven't been found for 90 days. This leaves you with 5 remaining homeless veterans. But during that time, your community identifies 3 new homeless veterans. Perhaps they're homeless for the first time, or maybe they're just back on your radar after disappearing for a while. Whatever the reason, your goal is the same: house them. So, you start February with 5 veterans from January, plus 3 new veterans. As you go through each month, pay attention to the total number of homeless veterans remaining relative to your average monthly housing rate. You're looking for the first number to be smaller than the second. In February, 2 veterans get housed and 1 goes inactive. At the same time, you identify 6 new veterans who need housing. All in all, 3 veterans came off the list, but 6 moved onto the list. So the community starts March with 11 actively homeless veterans. Do you see what happened there? 3 veterans came off your list, but the total number of actively homeless veterans didn't drop. It went up, because new veterans also entered your system. That's why it's so important to understand your inflow every month. In March, 5 veterans move off the list and 4 veterans get added, which means you enter April with 10 homeless veterans remaining. It goes on like this for a while: ebb and flow, ebb and flow. Remember, you're looking for the moment when the number of homeless veterans remaining drops below your monthly housing average. There. Did you see it? Functional zero. As long as the average number of veterans your community is moving into housing each month is greater than or equal to the number of veterans on your list, you're sustaining functional zero. Congratulations, and thank you for your service to America's veterans.
So lastly, you've got to make success visible. We're doing good work, and we need our communities to know that we're actually able to do this. And let me show you some of the techniques that we found to be really effective. Show off your buildings, the supportive housing buildings, any of the buildings that your housing organizations have built. And there's nothing better than before and after pictures. Here's some of the before and after exteriors and interiors of our buildings in New York. Here's a building that's opening later this month in Washington, D.C. for homeless veterans. And just incidentally, this is how the whole coordination of housing and the by name list works. The 60 homeless veterans who will be moving into this 124-unit building, we already know who they are. They're the 60 top veterans on Washington, D.C.'s by name list. That we're not cherry picking tenants anymore. Who's the most needy? They're coming with us. And of course, these wonderful Common Ground Adelaide buildings. You have your own amazing housing projects that welcome people back into the community to show off and to make more visible to others in South Australia. But there are other how you show success techniques. Nothing more powerful, again, than the before and after. This is a gentleman named Ed Givens, who when we first met him in Skid Row in Los Angeles had been homeless on the street for 17 years. And this was Ed 6 months after he moved into housing. And he's just been incredibly gracious in letting us share his photograph. And in fact, when we were invited to celebrate the success of the 100,000 Homes campaign at the White House, Ed came. And then we also are pretty good about, this is totally low tech, but every 2 weeks we send out a story of someone who is housed in the community team that housed that person. And then increasingly, the use of graphics is proving itself a very powerful way to tell a complex story. This is like the mess of the Los Angeles County non-housing system, like lots of random things. And that's what it looks like now, a really tightly coordinated system. So before I play this closing video, and I think video may be the most effective way at all to make success visible, I'm going to point out something so obvious that you might miss it in the video. The helpers here, the agency staff, you'll see the volunteers, the political leaders, people who've been in my pictures. What's happening is they're learning to solve a complicated problem facing their community together. And this defies the idea we have about ourselves in America these days, that we're indifferent to each other, we can't get along, that we're too divided, that we've lost our sense of common purpose. Through this movement, this effort that communities are stepping up to end homelessness, starting with the most vulnerable, we're witnessing communities being strengthened through the process of doing that. And now this is not an easy or quick formula that I'm offering for renewing our communities and defeating the fearmongers among us. But our history tells us the only way democracy is strengthened is when citizens take responsibility for each other and participating in solving the urgent challenges facing their communities. And if the emergence and growth of homelessness was the early warning sign, the canary in the coal mine, that our communities were in danger, well, we're seeing that coming together to end homelessness can be the solution to that problem.
One of the characteristic elements of humanity is focus. Just being aware that there are human beings who are suffering nearby is very easy to allow your focus to pass that by. But if you engage in the fact that that's true, I think that most human beings do have an intuitive and immediate response to suffering that they want to alleviate it.
Everyone deserves to be housed. The issue isn't where they're going to be housed. Let's not get to that point yet. Let's talk about everyone needs a roof over their head.
Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles.
Phoenix, Arizona. Greater New Orleans.
Houston. Fresno, California.
Prior to the 100,000 Homes campaign, it was difficult for anyone to think outside the box.
In many communities, urgency hadn't really been there around this issue.
We knew housing was the solution to homelessness, but nobody knew how to do it.
Homeless and chronically homeless individuals, and veterans in particular, that's a problem we can solve.
The City of Phoenix proudly announced that we got to functional zero among chronic veterans.
We've been able to bring down homelessness by 80% since 2007.
We saw the point-in-time count numbers, and there was this decrease.
Those were people that everyone would have said couldn't be housed.
I thought, double check the numbers. Like, that can't be right.
He's been on the streets 31 years. No way will you get him into housing.
How did we decrease it by 30%?
But we did. We did the impossible.
Take back your weather and bring me the skies. The day is so bright I can't open my eyes.
And now for the big news. Can I get a drum roll, please? As of right now, in just under 4 years, the communities participating in this movement have housed that's 101,628 of our most vulnerable neighbors, many of whom were at an extremely high risk for dying on our streets, are now safe in homes of their own. Yeah.
I think being a part of the campaign, I don't think I said this, but you realize you're not alone. There's still people who believe that people want to be homeless. When you do house somebody and you do change someone's life, it makes it so much easier to bear.
Alvin is an Army veteran who for more than 20 years battled alcoholism, unemployment, and the physical dangers that come with life on the streets. But he never gave up on trying to get housed, and he never gave up on his hope. A few weeks ago, Alvin moved into an apartment of his own and became, as best as we can tell, the 100,000th American to come home as part of this movement. Alvin Haggerty.
I appreciate the simple things in life now, like having a kitchen, having a bathroom. A lot of people take that for granted. This has been a long journey, but I can say I made it, but I still have many miles to go.
We know for sure there's no person that can't be housed and there's no community that can't be ending homelessness. Just, there's no putting that toothpaste back in the tube, basically. You can't go back from there.
Thank you.